Picture a single individual whose spiritual legacy flows through the veins of half the human race. Jews, Christians, and Muslims, civilizations that spent centuries killing each other, share at least one unshakable conviction. Everything started with him. Not with an emperor, not with a mythological deity, but with an anonymous craftsman who could have lived and died without the world ever noticing. The most jarring paradox of this story is that the man chosen to anchor the three largest religions on earth grew up making clay gods for a living. His father sold idols at the marketplace. His childhood unfolded among stone figurines, offerings to lunar deities, and pagan rituals indistinguishable from those practiced by any other family in the region. No priesthood, no royal bloodline, no external sign set him apart. So why did the creator of everything bet the entire arc of human history on an idol maker from Mesopotamia? The answer begins in a city most people would never connect to the cradle of faith. A city that defies expectations. Ur was no backwater village. It was a full-blown metropolis. Around 65,000 people lived there, a population that would outsize most European cities for the next 3,000 years. Situated in southern Mesopotamia in what is now Iraq, near the Euphrates River, Ur stood at the very peak of ancient civilization. When 20th-century archaeologists broke ground there, the findings stunned the world. Two-story homes with indoor plumbing, schools where children practiced mathematics and cuneiform writing on clay tablets, property records, and functioning courts of law. Ur conducted international trade with the Indus Valley, more than 3,000 miles away, using weighed silver as a standard currency, while most of humanity was still living in mud huts. But the true engine driving the city wasn't commerce. It was religion. At the center of Ur rose the ziggurat, a stepped brick tower climbing over 60 feet, roughly the height of a 7-story building, dedicated to Nana, the moon god. The priests of that temple controlled the economy, politics, and the agricultural calendar. Crossing them wasn't heresy, it was social and financial suicide. The cult involved nighttime processions under the full moon, trans-state dancing, and animal sacrifices whose smell of burning fat and incense hung over the city like a permanent cloud. That was the world Abram was born into. The son of a god-maker. Son of Terah, a craftsman whom Jewish tradition describes as an idol manufacturer, Abram grew up watching the family trade up close. The book of Genesis introduces the lineage with bureaucratic dryness. Terah fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Haran fathered Lot and then died before his own father, still in Ur, the first recorded instance in the Bible of a son dying before his parent. Lot, orphaned young, became Abram's permanent responsibility. The Bible doesn't narrate Abram's childhood. But the Midrash and the Book of Jubilees, texts from ancient Jewish tradition, sketch a fascinating portrait. From an early age, Abram noticed something no one around him seemed to see. The idols his father carved did absolutely nothing. They were clay. They cracked easily. They ate only silence. There's a famous scene in the Midrash, not biblical text but deeply illuminating, in which Terah left the young Abram minding the idol shop while he stepped out on business. When Terah returned, he found every idol smashed except the largest one, which stood holding a stick. When the furious father demanded an explanation, Abram answered with complete seriousness. A woman had brought a food offering, the idols started fighting over who would eat first, and the biggest one grabbed the stick and destroyed all the others. Terah exploded, "Are you out of your mind? They're made of clay, they can't move, they can't eat." And Abram replied, "Then why do you bow down to them?" Questioning the gods of Ur wasn't abstract philosophy. It was a direct assault on the power structure holding society together. And Abram was doing this at a time when the very concept of a single god didn't exist. There wasn't even a word for it. The command that left no room for negotiation. Genesis 12 verse 1. For words in Hebrew that would redirect the course of civilization. Lech lechat go. Get out of your country, from your family and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. Notice the layers built into that command. First, leave your homeland, the only culture you've ever known. Second, cut ties with your support network. Cousins, business allies, your survival infrastructure. Third, walk away from your father's house, the last thread connecting you to the world you understand. And go where exactly? To a land that I will show you. No name, no map, no declared destination. A blank check signed by a voice that no one around Abram recognized. Here's the detail most people skip right past. Abram was 75 years old when he obeyed. In the ancient world, reaching 75 meant you had outlived the vast majority of your generation. He wasn't a young man chasing adventure. He was someone who, by any reasonable measure, should have been sitting in a chair watching sunsets for whatever time he had left. And it's precisely at the moment the body says it's over that God says, now it begins. The promise attached to that command was so outsized it bordered on the absurd. Asterisk, I will make you a great nation, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Asterisk, all of them, not some, not the ones in the Middle East. A childless man married to a barren woman was being guaranteed that a nation would come from him that would reach every corner of the planet. The math didn't add up. That was exactly what made the promise extraordinary. Sarai, who would later become Sarah, was barren. The biblical text makes a point of underlining this before the promise is even delivered. It's not an accidental detail, it's the author setting the stage for what's about to happen. A promise of nationhood made to any man would be bold. Made to a 75-year-old with a wife who had never conceived, it was humanly impossible. And yet Abram went. The caravan into the unknown. Genesis 12 verse 4 is blunt. Asterisk, so Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him. Asterisk, no negotiation, no request for confirmation, no demand for a map. He took Sarai, took Lot, the orphan nephew he had assumed responsibility for, took the servants, the flocks and everything they had built up in Haran. And he headed south toward a land he had never seen, following the voice of a God no one around him knew. Picture that caravan. Dozens of people pushing through the Syrian desert toward Canaan. Camels loaded with goatskin tents. Leather water skins, sacks of grain, bronze tools. The sun hammering the limestone without mercy, wind kicking up dust that stuck to the teeth and stung the eyes. With every day's march, you fell farther behind. With every night camped under the stars, the familiar world faded a little more. The most likely route followed what historians call the Fertile Crescent. Up from Haran in northern Mesopotamia, then curving down along the Syrian coast into Canaan. Over 1,000 miles on foot with animals and cargo, crossing hostile tribal territories, with no paved roads, no maps, no guarantee of water at the next well. Months of travel. When Abram finally reached Canaan, he didn't find empty land with a welcome sign waiting for him. Genesis 12 verse 6 records the quiet, devastating detail. Asterisk, the Canaanites were then in the land. Asterisk, the promised place already had owners, peoples with cities, armies and their own gods. Abram arrived as a foreigner. As an immigrant. As a nobody. It was at Shechem near the terebinth tree of Moreh that God spoke again. This time the promise got an address. Asterisk, to your descendants I will give this land. Asterisk, notice it doesn't say to you, it says to your descendants. Abram wouldn't own a square foot of it in his lifetime. He was receiving an inheritance that would only be collected after he was dead. And what did he do? He stacked up stones and built an altar in the middle of enemy territory, worshipping the invisible God who had brought him there. Cracks in the hero. The Bible doesn't write flawless heroes, and Abram is no exception. Shortly after arriving in the Promised Land, a severe drought hit Canaan and the patriarch headed down to Egypt, the same Egypt that would enslave his descendants centuries later. Afraid he'd be killed because of Sarai's extraordinary beauty, even at 65, Abram asked her to say she was his sister. Technically it wasn't a complete lie. Sarai was his half-sister, same father but different mothers. But the intent was clearly deceptive. The outcome was exactly what he feared, only worse. Sarai was taken into Pharaoh's palace. Pharaoh was captivated by her and showered Abram with gifts: sheep, cattle, servants, camels. The patriarch got rich off his own wife sitting in another man's harem. The biblical text doesn't soften the scene. It sits there raw and uncomfortable. But God didn't stay silent. He struck Pharaoh and his entire household with serious plagues, the first time that word appears connected to Egypt, centuries before Moses. The plagues were severe enough that Pharaoh uncovered the truth and confronted Abram with an indignation that's almost comical. Asterisk, what is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me she was your wife? Asterisk, a pagan king giving a moral lecture to the father of faith. If you were expecting a perfect Abram, brace yourself. This failure in Egypt is only the first crack in the armor. The separation and the war. Abram left Egypt humiliated but absurdly wealthy. Pharaoh, perhaps out of fear of the God who had sent the plagues, never took back his gifts. Abram returned to the Negev with a substantial fortune, and among the Egyptian servants he had acquired was a young woman named Hagar. Remember that name. She's going to ignite consequences that are still burning today. The immediate problem was something else entirely. Abram was rich, Lot was rich, and the land couldn't support them both. Genesis 13 verse 6 is surgical. Asterisk, the land was not able to support them that they might dwell together, for their possessions were so great. Asterisk hundreds of animals competing for every well and every green valley in a semi-arid region. Both camps' herdsmen were constantly at each other's throats. And here Abram does something no patriarch in the ancient world would ever do. He, the elder, the one with absolute authority over his nephew, offered Lot the right to choose first. Asterisk, the whole land is before you. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left. Asterisk, in the ancient world, the elder always chose first. No exceptions. Abram surrendered a privilege no one surrendered. But he could afford to be generous because he had something Lot didn't. A promise. The creator of the universe had already told him that all of that land would belong to his descendants. When you have that kind of guarantee, you don't need to fight over water wells. Lot looked around and chose with his eyes. The Jordan plain stretched out to the east like a green carpet, fertile and well-watered. Genesis compares it to the Garden of Eden. At the heart of that plain sat two cities already infamous in the ancient world, Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot pitched his tents toward Sodom. The Bible tracks the progression with clinical precision. First he looked toward Sodom, then he camped nearby, then he was living inside the city, sitting at the gate like a respected citizen. That's how a fall works. Never one big leap, always a series of small steps in the wrong direction. The text plants a time bomb right after. Asterisk, but the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked and sinful against the Lord. Asterisk. Meanwhile, Genesis 14 opens with a war that most readers skip, but which is one of the historically richest passages in the entire Old Testament. For Eastern kings, led by Kedorlaomer of Elam, had dominated 5 cities of the plain for 12 years. In the 13th year the cities rebelled. In the 14th, Kedorlaomer came back to crush the uprising. Elam was a military power, the equivalent of modern-day Iran. The coalition swept through the region. Sodom and Gomorrah were looted. And Lot was taken prisoner along with everything he owned. A refugee reached Abram's camp with the news. And then a side of Abram emerged that Sunday school rarely mentions. Abram mobilized 318 trained fighters born within his own camp and went after the enemy. To field 318 combat-ready men born in-house, his settlement had to have at least 1,000 to 2,000 people. This was no wandering shepherd. He was the equivalent of a Bedouin sheik with real military power. Using guerrilla tactics, he split his forces, attacked at night, and pursued the invaders for over 200 miles, from Dan all the way north of Damascus. He recovered Lot, every captive and all the stolen goods. The victory was so total that 2 kings came out to meet him on his return. Those 2 encounters reveal everything about who Abram really was. The first was the king of Sodom, humiliated, still coated with the tar from the pits where he'd fallen. His offer was straightforward. Asterisk, give me the people and take the goods for yourself. Asterisk, by the customs of the day, everything belonged to Abram by right of conquest. An offer no warrior in the ancient world would refuse. But before he could respond, a second king appeared, Melchizedek, king of Salem, which tradition identifies as the future Jerusalem, and priest of God Most High. He brought bread and wine and blessed Abram with words that would echo for millennia. The text offers no explanation of who Melchizedek was, where he came from, when he was born, or when he died. He appears out of nowhere like a lightning bolt and vanishes. The book of Hebrews in the New Testament spends an entire chapter on this figure, comparing him directly to Christ, an eternal priest without genealogy, without beginning or end. In that moment, Abram bowed before this priest king and gave him a tithe of everything, 10% of the entire spoil of war. It's the first mention of the tithe in the Bible, and it came from Abram. Then he turned to the king of Sodom and refused everything. Asterisk, I have raised my hand to the Lord, God Most High, and have sworn that I will not take a thread or a sandal strap or anything that is yours, lest you say, I have made Abram rich. Asterisk, nothing. Not an animal, not a coin. A man who had risked his life on a military campaign spanning hundreds of miles refused every piece of the spoils. Because his prosperity could not be traced back to Sodom. The source had to be beyond question. After the war, after the diplomacy with kings, after refusing Sodom's fortune, came silence. And in the silence came fear. Genesis 15 opens with God saying, Do not be afraid, which tells you Abram was afraid. It made sense. He had just humiliated 4 powerful kings and retaliation could arrive at any moment. But Abram's deepest dread ran deeper than military threat. What came out of his mouth is the most honest cry in all the patriarchal narrative. Asterisk, Lord God, what will you give me, seeing I go childless? Asterisk, there it was, the open wound. Every promise, the land, the nation, the universal blessing, hinged on one thing, an heir. And the only candidate was Eliezer of Damascus, a servant, an employee. The divine response didn't come through theological arguments. It came through an experience. God led him outside and said, "Look now toward heaven, and count the stars if you are able to number them. So shall your descendants be." Picture the moment. An old man past 75 standing in the Negev desert, with no artificial light for hundreds of miles in any direction. The Milky Way stretched from horizon to horizon like a river of white fire. The sky so packed with stars it looked solid. And then Genesis 15 verse 6, arguably the most influential verse in the entire Hebrew Bible. And he believed in the Lord, and he accounted it to him for righteousness. That single sentence would anchor Paul's theology, the doctrine of the Protestant Reformation, and the understanding of billions of people about what it means to have a relationship with God. Not through rituals, not through sacrifices, not through works. Through faith. Abram believed and that was enough. But God knew faith needed something tangible. What happened next is the most unsettling scene in the entire book of Genesis. God told Abram to bring a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove and a young pigeon. Abram cut them in half and laid each half facing the other, creating a corridor of flesh and blood, the ground soaked dark red, the metallic smell of fresh blood mixed with the heat of the desert. Birds of prey began descending on the carcasses, and Abram spent the entire day driving them away, alone, covered in blood, waiting for something he couldn't name. When the sun went down, a deep sleep fell over him, not the sleep of rest but of terror. The Hebrew word is ima, a supernatural dread that doesn't come from the physical world. Lying among split carcasses, submerged in thick darkness, Abram heard God describe what lay ahead for his descendants. 400 years of slavery in a foreign land. God didn't hide the cost before sealing the deal. And then, in total darkness between the halves of the dead animals, a smoking furnace and a burning torch passed through the corridor of blood. In the ancient world, when two kings made a covenant, both walked between the split animals. A mutual declaration that if the agreement were broken, what happened to those animals would happen to the treaty breaker. It was a death oath with both parties equally bound. In this covenant only God passed through. Abram was asleep. He didn't walk, didn't swear, didn't commit to anything. The creator of the universe took both ends of the agreement onto himself alone. If the promise failed, if the descendants never came, if the land was never delivered, God was essentially saying, let it happen to me. Signing a contract where only one party can be held liable, and that party is God. Theologians call this an unconditional covenant. Abram didn't need to do anything to keep it valid. It was sealed in blood, in fire, in darkness. And it would shadow human history like a mark that never fades, outlasting empires, exiles, holocausts, and rebirths that defy every rule of historical logic. Hagar and the limits of human patience. If God had promised a son, why wasn't Sarai getting pregnant? The years kept moving, the promise kept aging, and Sarai's patience ran out. By the time she turned 85, 10 years in Canaan, 10 years since the original promise, 10 years of waking up with hope and going to sleep with disappointment, she made a decision that looks shocking to modern eyes but was established legal protocol in the ancient world, documented in clay contracts discovered at Nuzi in Mesopotamia. The Lord has kept me from having children. Go in to my maid, perhaps I shall obtain children by her. The young Egyptian woman Hagar, the one I told you to remember, was given to Abram as a kind of Bronze Age surrogate arrangement. The Nuzi contracts from the 2nd millennium BC describe this practice exactly. If the primary wife was barren, she was expected to provide her husband with a servant, and any child born would be legally considered the wife's. All perfectly within the rules. But legal rules don't govern the human heart. Hagar conceived, and the moment that pregnancy began to show, the entire dynamic inside the tent shifted. When she saw that she had conceived, her mistress became despised in her eyes. Hagar looked at Sarai with that wordless contempt that needs no translation. Every time she ran her hand across her belly, every quiet smile, every slightly slower walk, a message without sound. I can do what you cannot. Sarai broke. She turned on Abram with fury. My wrong be upon you. May the Lord judge between you and me. And Abram, the man who had faced down 4 kings, who had turned down Sodom's fortune, who had received divine visions, washed his hands of it. Indeed your maid is in your hand, do to her as you please. The most cowardly thing he could have said. Sarai's treatment of Hagar was harsh enough to drive her away. Pregnant, alone, without water or a destination, an Egyptian slave crossing the Negev desert trying to find her way back home like a wounded animal. And then something happened that was genuinely revolutionary for the era. God went after Hagar. Not Abram. Not Sarai. Hagar, a slave, a foreigner, a woman with no rights and no tribe to protect her. The angel found her by a spring of water in the wilderness on the road to Shur and called her by name. In the ancient world, slaves didn't have names, they had functions. But God knew exactly who she was. The instruction was hard: return to your mistress and submit yourself under her hand. But it came wrapped in a promise no slave in the ancient world had ever received. I will multiply your descendants exceedingly, so that they shall not be counted for multitude. The same language used with Abram. And the son she was carrying would be named Ishmael. In Hebrew, God hears. A permanent reminder that God hears the crying of a slave. Hagar did something no other biblical character had done before her. She gave God a name. You are the God who sees me, El Roy. The well where it happened was named Bir Lahai Roy, the well of the one who lives and sees me, located between Kadesh and Bered in the northern Sinai. A real place, marked forever by the moment God saw a woman nobody else was looking at. Hagar returned, submitted, and gave birth to Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old and finally had a son. Islamic tradition considers Ishmael the direct ancestor of Muhammad and the Arab peoples. Jewish tradition acknowledges him as the firstborn, but not the son of the promise. And in that fracture, between the son of a human plan and the son of a divine one, a rivalry was born that has spanned millennia and is still drawing blood. 13 years of silence. Between Genesis 16 and Genesis 17, 13 years disappear in a single page turn. No visions, no voice, no angel. Abram spent those years raising Ishmael, most likely convinced the boy was the fulfilled promise. 13 years believing Sarai's plan had worked. 13 years of routine, pastoral life, and normalcy. Then on the first day of the 14th year, when Abram was 99 years old, God reappeared and dismantled everything Abram thought he knew. He changed his name from Abram, exalted father, to Abraham, father of many nations. Imagine walking through your camp with that title for 13 years and not having a single legitimate heir. Every time someone called his name was a public reminder of the pending promise, like nicknaming a bankrupt man, the millionaire, and making him answer to it every single day. Sarai also got a new name, from Sarai, my princess, to Sarah, princess, no possessive, no longer belonging to just one man, princess of nations. And then God said the words that made Abraham laugh. Literally laugh, face pressed to the ground. Sarah your wife shall bear you a son. Abraham was 99. Sarah was 90. It wasn't a laugh of faith, it was a laugh of pure absurdity, of sheer disbelief. And right after the laughter came the attempted negotiation. Oh, that Ishmael might live before you. Translation: forget that impossible plan, I already have a son. God didn't accept the substitute. Ishmael would be blessed, 12 princes, a great nation. But the eternal covenant would pass through Isaac, through the son who didn't yet exist. Before the son, though, came the sign, and it wasn't a pleasant one. Circumcision for every male in the camp. Abraham, Ishmael, every servant, every slave. Abraham was 99 when he was circumcised. Ishmael was 13. That same day hundreds of men went through the procedure. Everyone wounded at once, everyone incapacitated at once, the entire camp left vulnerable. If any enemy had attacked at that moment, it would have been a massacre. No one attacked. The three visitors. Genesis 18 opens with a domestic scene that conceals an earthquake. At noon, the sun straight overhead, turning every rock into a furnace. Abraham was sitting at the entrance to his tent when he looked up and saw 3 men standing before him. His reaction was immediate and way out of proportion. He ran to meet them, bowed to the ground, offered water for their feet, shade to rest in, and a morsel of bread that turned into an elaborate full meal. Around 45 pounds of fine flour baked into fresh bread, a tender calf, butter, and milk. For 3 strangers in the middle of the desert. Abraham, at 99 years old, freshly circumcised, ran back and forth under 100-degree heat to serve men he didn't yet recognize. But there was something about them. When they asked where is Sarah your wife? The fact that they already knew her name said everything. And then the promise came a third time, now with a specific time frame. I will certainly return to you according to the time of life, and behold, Sarah your wife shall have a son. Sarah was listening from behind the tent curtain and laughed to herself. After I have grown old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also? The visitor, whom the text now explicitly identifies as the Lord, turned to Abraham. Asterisk, why did Sarah laugh? Asterisk, Sarah denied it. Asterisk, I did not laugh. Asterisk, the answer came back short as thunder. Asterisk, no, but you did laugh. Asterisk, he knew. He always knows. After the meal, the visitors turned their gaze towards Sodom. And God did something extraordinary. He thought out loud, deliberating whether to hide his plans from Abraham, and decided to tell him. The outcry against Sodom was great, the sin grievous, and destruction was coming. What followed is the most audacious negotiation in all of sacred history. Asterisk, would you also destroy the righteous with the wicked? Asterisk, Abraham started at 50. If there were 50 righteous people in the city, would God spare it? Yes. 45? Yes. 40? 30? 20? 10? At every round, God granted the request. Abraham stopped at 10, perhaps because he believed that in the city where Lot lived with his family, there had to be at least 10 decent people. He was wrong. The two angels arrived in Sodom at evening. Lot was sitting at the city gate, the position of a judge or elder, a respected citizen. The man who years earlier had pitched his tents toward Sodom was now part of the establishment. He insisted the two strangers stay at his house, not out of politeness but out of desperation. He knew what happened to visitors after sundown. Before they could lie down, the house was surrounded. The men of Sodom, from the youngest to the oldest, from every neighborhood. What they were demanding left no room for metaphorical interpretation. The angels pulled Lot inside and struck the mob with blindness, and in that forced darkness, the men of Sodom kept groping at the door. The blindness didn't stop them. The compulsion was stronger than the pain. At dawn, the angels grabbed Lot by the hand, his wife's hand and his daughter's hands, and physically dragged them out. Lot didn't leave on his own, he was hauled out. Mercy showed up as brute force. The instruction was clear. Asterisk, escape for your life. Do not look behind you nor stay anywhere in the plain. Asterisk, don't look back. When sulfur began to fall and the sky turned orange, then red, then black, when the ground shook and the air filled with a roar that sounded like the world tearing itself apart, Lot's wife looked. The text doesn't explain what she saw. The house, her friends, the life left behind. Maybe all of it at once. She became a pillar of salt. She didn't die, didn't fall. She froze in the act of looking backward. Sodom burned. The plain Lot had chosen for its Eden-like fertility became the lowest point on the earth's surface. The Dead Sea, 1,410 feet below sea level, with salinity so extreme nothing can survive in it. The most fertile land in the Middle East became the most barren place on the planet. Geologists have found layers of ash and crystallized sulfur along the southwest shore of the Dead Sea. Sulfur spheres with 98% purity, a concentration found nowhere else naturally on Earth. Something happened there. Catastrophic, localized, absolute. Abraham woke that morning and saw smoke rising like from a furnace. The man who had negotiated with God for 10 righteous people discovered there weren't even 10. The smoke from Sodom had barely cleared when the impossible promise started moving. Sarah became pregnant at 90. The text offers no explanation, no rationalization, no softening. It simply states, asterisk, the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had spoken. For Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the set time of which God had spoken. Asterisk, at the set time. Not Abraham's timeline. Not Sarah's. God's. 25 years after the original promise. 25 years of waiting, doubting, failed human attempts, and inexplicable divine silence. The boy's name was Isaac. In Hebrew he laughs, because Abraham laughed when God promised, Sarah laughed when she heard through the curtain, and now Sarah said, asterisk, God has made me laugh and all who hear will laugh with me. Asterisk, the laugh of disbelief had become a laugh of joy. What seemed like a joke had become a miracle. The child's name was living proof that God has a sense of humor, and that the last laugh is always his. But the joy brought a wound with it. When Isaac was weaned, around age 3, Abraham threw a great feast. Sarah saw Ishmael laughing. The Hebrew verb shares the same root as Isaac's name. Mocking, playing, mimicking. The text doesn't specify the exact tone. Generations of scholars have debated it. For Sarah it was enough. Asterisk, cast out this slave woman and her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac. Asterisk. Abraham felt the weight of that in his chest. Ishmael was his firstborn. 14 years of memories. But God confirmed it. Asterisk, listen to whatever Sarah tells you. Asterisk, and in a morning described with an economy of words that hurts, Abraham rose early, took bread and a skin of water, put them on Hagar's shoulder, handed her the boy and sent them away. The mountain where everything was decided. And then came the test. The test that defines Abraham. The test that defines faith. The test that 4,000 years later still keeps theologians, philosophers, and parents awake at night. Take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering. Notice the construction, not simply sacrifice Isaac. God stacked layers of pain into the command, your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac. Each word another blade pushed deeper. And Abraham's response. He rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, split the wood, took 2 servants and the boy. No argument, no protest, no attempt to bargain. The man who had negotiated with God over 10 righteous people in Sodom said not a single word for his own son. 3 days of walking while knowing what he was going to do. 3 days watching the boy carry the firewood on his back, not knowing it was the wood for his own pyre. 3 days of silence. The text records not a single spoken word during the journey. On the 3rd day, spotting the place from a distance, he told the servants, "Stay here with the donkey, the lad and I will go yonder and worship and we will come back to you." We will come back, plural. That was faith or the irrational hope that God would find a way. The book of Hebrews suggests Abraham believed God could raise Isaac from the dead, a theology without precedent, invented on the road to sacrifice. Isaac asked with the innocence that breaks any father's heart, "Look, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" And Abraham answered with the most loaded sentence in all of Scripture. "My son, God will provide for himself the lamb." Yahweh Jireh. God will provide. He built the altar, arranged the wood, bound Isaac, and the son didn't resist. No record of a struggle, a cry, an attempt to run. Rabbinical tradition estimates Isaac was somewhere between 25 and 37 years old at this point. He was a grown man who allowed himself to be bound. The son's obedience mirrored the father's. Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife. The angel called out at the last possible second. Abraham, do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Abraham raised his eyes and saw a ram caught by its horns in a thicket. On that mountain he etched a name that has never faded, Yahweh Jireh, on the mountain of the Lord it shall be provided. Mount Moriah, where Solomon would build the temple 1,000 years later. Where the Romans would destroy it 2,000 years after that. Where the Dome of the Rock stands today, the single most contested geopolitical point in the modern world. A father who almost sacrificed his son became the spiritual epicenter of 3 world religions. The end of a life. Sarah died at 127 in Hebron, and Abraham wept. The patriarch who had faced down pharaohs, defeated military coalitions, negotiated with God, and raised a knife over his own son, wept. Then he did something that sounds ordinary but was quietly revolutionary. He bought land. He negotiated with Ephron the Hittite, paid 400 shekels of silver, an inflated price because the seller knew Abraham had no alternative, and acquired the cave of Machpelah. The first piece of legal property belonging to the people of Israel in the Promised Land wasn't taken by force. It was purchased with a deed, witnesses, and counted currency. That cave still exists. In Hebron, the Ibrahim Mosque, also called the Tomb of the Patriarchs, marks the site where tradition says Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Leah are buried. It is one of the oldest continuously venerated sites on earth, and one of the most heavily guarded, split between a synagogue and a mosque watched over by armed soldiers. Abraham died at 175. And the text registers a detail that almost slips by unnoticed. His sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him. Both of them together, the son of the promise and the son of the slave woman, the heir of the covenant and the exile of the desert, side by side burying their father. At that funeral, for one brief moment, the fracture healed. Perhaps that is Abraham's final lesson. Not perfect faith, because he lied, doubted, tried to engineer everything himself, and nearly destroyed the people he loved. Not flawless obedience, because he delayed, questioned, laughed at the promise and offered substitutes. The lesson is that God doesn't wait for people who are ready. He chooses broken people and walks with them until the promise matures. Not in them but in him. Abraham is called the father of many nations not because he was perfect, but because despite everything he kept walking.